I'm now very pleased to turn to Carol Bellamy. She's the chair of the governing board of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, GCERF. Carol, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Let me also join others in thanking the organizers for this important meeting and for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, GCERF. I'm also pleased to have the opportunity to share this panel with Ambassador de Klerk, who is one of GCERF's board members as well, the third hat that he wears. It is very important that the organizers have identified mobilizing resources as a key agenda item for today's conference, and while I share Ambassador de Klerk's view that resources are broad in their definition, I'm going to focus my remarks primarily on financial resources. Unfortunately, I think there's a real risk that we are beginning to talk the talk on preventing violent extremism, but we do not yet walk the walk. Summits, conferences, and dialogues are important, but even more important is action. Speaking of action, I'm proud that GCERF is about to issue its first grants to local community initiatives to build resilience against violent extremism in 3 countries, Bangladesh, Mali, and Nigeria. We hear again and again about a preventing PVE funding gap that needs to be filled. GCERF is starting to fill that gap. Implementing the Secretary General's plan of action, whether at international, regional, national, or local levels, requires money. And in my experience at GCERF, resources for preventing violent extremism are still much too scarce. Let me make 3 observations. First, the majority of the limited funding to date for PVE comes from the security and counterterrorism side of the House. These government agencies have enormous budgets, of course, but the vast majority of their funds are still spent on security, military intelligence, and law enforcement responses. There is still skepticism in these parts of government for investing significantly in so-called softer or more preventative responses, especially as these cannot deliver immediate results. I strongly urge that there should be a greater allocation of funds to PVE from these budgets. Having said that, I think there is greater potential to raise significant funds for PVE from the development arms of government, as has been mentioned already today. And allow me to acknowledge here that GCERF receives a very generous contribution from the Swiss Development Agency through SDC, through their development arm. But just as many security actors are skeptical of development approaches, so many development actors are nervous about the securitization of development funds. We need to work harder to build understanding between security and development actors. Preventing violent extremism is relevant to both agendas. Indeed, the way I characterize GCERF is that we use development principles and tools, for example, women's empowerment, vocational training, youth engagement, income-generating activities, arts, sport, and I could go on. We use these development principles and tools to achieve security outcomes by building resilience in communities at risk. I note, however, that there have been 2 important recent initiatives that should help build the bridge between security and development, both of which have been mentioned. The first is the New Development Agenda, the global goals, that recognizes that ultimately achieving development goals depends on security, peace and security. SDGs 10 and 16 are especially relevant in this case. Second, as we heard from Ms. Lamore, OECD DAC has recently recognized PVE interventions as DACable, as we say. My second observation is that resourcing PVE need not always mean generating new funds. Many of the projects and programs currently funded around the world are already relevant to PVE. And I mentioned some before: education, women's empowerment, youth, social justice, food security, refugee assistance, and so on. What is needed is to enhance these initiatives to make them more PVE specific. For example, education is clearly PVE relevant. Hopefully, better educated youth are more able to think critically and find constructive alternatives to what is on offer from extremist groups. But making educational initiatives PVE specific means adjusting curricula to include, for example, interfaith dialogue or religious understanding. It also means including an element on PVE in our monitoring and evaluation frameworks. The line between what is PVE relevant and PVE specific is not always clear, and points up, again, the need for more research in this field. My third and final point is that we should not place all of our hopes on the private sector. I know we're going to hear from the private sector next. For certain, the private sector has a vested interest in preventing violent extremism. Violent extremism diverts talent, disrupts supply chains, and puts entire regions out of reach of safe investment. GCERF is a public-private partnership, and we have benefited from very important in-kind contributions from our private sector partners, including as a member of our governing board. But I do not believe it is realistic for GCERF or any other PVE actor to expect significant financial resources from the private sector, at least in the short term. More promising, in my opinion, is to look to the private sector to create jobs and economic opportunities to affected communities. As the chair of GCERF, the Global Fund for Preventing Violent Extremism, my main job is to raise money. I look forward to working with all of you to overcome the existing obstacles to mobilizing resources for PVE to ensure that we really can implement the UN Plan of Action. Thank you.